Okay, now we're going to get into the components of sprinting and how to make someone an effective sprinter. I think it's worth mentioning right now that when we're talking about running, there is a difference between all-out sprinting or trying to get to your max velocity versus distance running or something that's more associated with endurance. Now, some of the principles are very similar, very basic, but if we look at high-level distance runners or high-level sprinters, there are some subtle differences between techniques. And so just understand that we're not going to say that they're all exactly the same in terms of the relationship between each other. Now, what makes for a good sprinting, or what goes into your sprinting and what level of ability you have? Well, the first one should be pretty obvious, and we've talked about it previously. It's genetics. There are specific genes in your body that can make you an excellent sprinter. So, for example, when we talked about muscle fiber types, we said that genetics determined a decent amount of what type of fibers you have. So if we were building a sprinter and you have more type 2X fibers than the average person due to your genetics, you're going to have an advantage in sprinting because of those added type 2X muscle fibers. And so that's just one example of how genetics can actually influence your ability to sprint. The next component is strength. And it should be no shock that strength is important for sprinting, because remember, strength is just the ability to apply force, right? And we said force is just mass times acceleration. So if we're talking about strength, we're talking about accelerating an object. Well, what specifically are we accelerating? We're accelerating our body. And so if we can accelerate our body to use this force to generate and get that movement associated with it, we're going to be more successful in the grand scheme of things. Power is very similar to strength, although remember, power, the big difference between the two is power is strength divided by time. So it's not just how much force you can produce, it's how quickly you can generate that force. Remember when we talked about plyometrics, we said that plyometrics was really focused on enhancing power development and how quickly you can create that force. Flexibility will also be a component of sprinting, because if you're not flexible enough to get into the advantageous positions, or if you struggle to get in those positions comfortably, you're not going to be able to generate the same amount of force and use the correct techniques to run effectively. It can also affect it in terms of injury. So if you lack a lot of flexibility in certain areas, or if you have very tight musculature or different tissues that are restricted, you can actually increase the incidence of injuries in sprinting. Now, that said, there is a good level of tightness associated with sprinting. So you'll know a lot of sprinters talk about having really tight hamstrings. And we actually found that in terms of just abilities and individuals, sprinters get a lot of muscle strains in their hamstrings, so they pull that muscle quite a bit. Well, if you're sitting here, you're thinking, okay, maybe they should do more stretching and get that hamstring to relax so that's not as tight. And if you're just thinking about it from an injury standpoint, yes, you are correct. If you increase the flexibility and you got that muscle to relax, it would decrease the amount of injuries, but it would also make you slower. Because remember, that muscle is kind of like a spring. And so if that spring is really rigid and it bounces, yes, it's more likely to strain and have that injury associated with it, but it also generates way more force because it's in that tight and really bound state. And so it's a trade-off with sprinters. They trade off the tightness of that hamstring and the risk for injury for greater force output. The last one is going to be technique. And I think this one should go without saying that technique is going to be a huge factor in how successful you are as a sprinter. If you have very bad technique, it's going to affect your ability to use your strength, use your power, use your flexibility. And so technique is going to go hand in hand with this. And when we're looking at technique, we're going to be looking at things like your posture, we're going to look at your arm action or your arm mechanics, and then we're going to be looking at your leg mechanics. And what those three things need to be doing correctly to help you have that optimal level of sprinting. Now, if we were going to create the ultimate sprinter, what would be the formula, or what would be the recipe? So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at mass. Do you think it would be advantageous to have a lot of mass or a little bit of mass? Well, think about it this way. If you were designing a car to race in NASCAR, would you want to get the biggest monster truck possible, or would you want your car to have only the essentials on board so that it was as light as possible? Well, if you think about it that way, it makes sense that you wouldn't want a ton of extra mass, right? You would want the amount you need to have a really effective engine, right? Think of it kind of like your muscles, right? You want muscles to actually propel your body down the track. You want an engine on your NASCAR to actually launch that vehicle. But there's going to be a limit to how big that engine needs to be, as well as there's going to be a limit to how much extra mass you want, right? You wouldn't put a 6 sound system in a NASCAR because it doesn't make sense and it's going to restrict your ability, right? It's just added weight that you don't need. And so when we're talking about the recipe for the optimal sprinter, we want a small amount of mass. And we don't want anything extra. We want the bare essentials to help us propel ourselves down the track. The next one we want is we want a lot of force, right? So we said that force equals mass times acceleration. So if we have a small amount of mass and we can generate a lot of force, that's going to lead to a really high level of acceleration, right? And that's going to help us get to those high velocities. So we want muscles that are capable of producing a lot of force, and that's why we want to train them. The next one is the direction we're applying that force. So when you're putting force into the ground, if you put force straight down, you're going to go straight up. If you put force straight back, you're going to go straight out. And so when we're looking at sprinting, we're actually going to be looking at a combination of not just putting force straight down into the ground, but putting force down and back. So we propel ourselves and we launch ourselves straight forward as we're running. And so that's going to be a key piece of information. And we'll notice with a lot of beginners or people who don't have really good technique is that they put too much force sometimes down into the ground and they go too much up, or they put too much force down and they just don't go as far up, they just kind of go flat when they're running. And so where you're putting that force is going to dictate how fast you're moving. The last one is minimal contact time. So just like with our plyometrics, right, we talked about making contact with the ground and then immediately propelling yourself into your next jump repeatedly. Sprinting is just a series of these bounds or these jump-like strides is what we'll call them, where your foot's in contact with the ground for a very short span of time and then it's back up again. Very short span of time, then it's back up again. And so if we make that ground contact time short as possible, we're not going to be slowing ourselves down, because every time we make contact with the ground, it actually acts almost like a brake. It's a braking system. So you make contact when you get to your high velocity, it slows you down a little bit. So the longer your foot is in contact with the ground, the more it's going to slow you down. If we put all those things together, so our small amount of mass, our high level of force production, the ability to put that force in the correct direction, and then minimal contact time to reduce the braking effect, we have a very fast sprinter, someone who can actually perform at a high level for their sprint day.